All right. I know I said that I'd have this posted by 8 o'clock, but I guess I failed. Anyway, be 8:30, whatever. This is the video for John. This is basically our notes for the unit before the test, which some of you will be taking starting tomorrow, some of others Friday or Monday, depending on how it lines up. Anyway, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. You're going to notice that, if you're in one of my college prep classes, your notes may not perfectly match these ones. They're basically the same, but there are some things that I switched up. But don't worry about it. If you see some differences, try to follow along anyway. So, John and the Philosophers. John writes for an educated, philosophical audience. Specifically, they are Jewish and they live in the regions surrounding Judea at the time that he writes. So there's that. As philosophers, they end up embroiled or they end up entangled in some debates that most people may not care all that much about. Debates like, what is the nature of the universe? What does it mean to say that something is real? How can we know the truth? If we're always affected by the narratives that people tell us. Can things exist beyond time? Is time... So all these difficult questions that most people would sort of say, who cares? The philosophers are going to put a lot of time into. And it turns out these questions actually are pretty important. But most people just kind of assume an answer and move on with life. Anyway, there's also theological debates because, of course, you've had all these different groups coming through Judea in the previous centuries. When you have your country invaded by the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, everybody, you're exposed to a lot of ideas, and as a result, you're going to call every one of your beliefs into question. So there are a lot of debates around the time that John writes, which is maybe around 110 A.D., about all of this kind of stuff. John is going to be writing for these highly educated people because he's one of them. Before I go farther, want to just point out John takes a very different approach, but at no point should you start to feel like this is a radically different message from the other three Gospels, if that makes sense. It's the same big message. It's the same set of beliefs. It's just explained for a very different audience, with the result that we have a very different Gospel. As a theologian, of course, John is going to start with a question about what is God. And I put this example here. This is the one on the left is God in South Park. The one on the right is Jesus. If you know South Park at all, they're always sort of poking fun at everything. Nothing is sacred, so to speak, for them. This is an absurd example. I don't think very many people believe in a God of this sort. But it matters tremendously when you talk about religious matters that everybody gets on the same page with regard to their assumptions regarding these questions. So who is God? What does it mean to believe in God? Maybe in some cases, what is God? These are questions that are really important because if you don't all get on the same page about what God is, who God is, what Jesus is, who Jesus is, etc., then to talk about trying to follow them or really believe in them is really difficult because everybody in the room will have different images of exactly what they're talking about in mind. Hopefully that makes sense. So John's going to start with a definition of what he means when he speaks about God. And here's his definition, the underlined part especially. Most of you have probably seen this quote, God is love, before. However, most of us, because it's actually an extremely unnatural structure for an English sentence, just a noun, the verb to be, and then another noun, we have a tendency to sort of reduce it a little bit and drop it down to God loves. So most of us have learned it that way our whole lives. And that is true, but it doesn't give you the whole picture. There's a difference, if you think about it, between being something and doing something. So if you say like, oh yeah, he's being pretty awesome right now, even if you don't say the phrase right now, the implication there is that there are other times when he's not being so awesome. Right? If we say God loves, it leaves a little bit of wiggle room for people to say, but does he do it always? That's why John goes with God is actually love itself. It's not that he loves sometimes, it's that that's his very nature. Uh, and so John's going to go a really mystical route on this. So we'll talk about that in the coming slides. But keep in mind that this doesn't say God loves. That is part of the story. This says God is love, which is a far bigger story. So here it is in other words. John means that God and love are the same thing. It's not just that God loves, it is that God is love itself. And we're talking about the reality of love itself, sort of in the abstract, rather than any single instance. That's important because, of course, single instances of human love can start and end. They can, be problematic. They can be manipulative or abusive or possessive or any of these sort of negative things because we're not perfect beings. But they all reflect a higher reality of love, which is itself perfect and which itself exists independently of time and space. Right? It doesn't matter how far apart we are from somebody, we're capable of loving them. It doesn't matter if that person's been dead for 20 years, we're capable of loving them. Right? And that's kind of the idea here. That reality behind love, love itself, in other words, is what we're talking about when we talk about God. I always put no singing. What is love? This is where you're going to see some differences between the phases in your notes. But in short, the New Testament says a lot of stuff about love, but it uses 6 different terms. And there's a clear belief very early on in Christianity that all of these forms of love are beautiful gifts. We go down these Greek terms here, eros, the top one, you can see the word erotic kind of in there. It's the same root. And of course, you know already what erotic love is. That sort of passionate, sort of, where you get fired up about somebody and et cetera, et cetera. You can figure out the rest. But there's that. Philia is friendship, which is when you just, you have a connection with somebody, you like being around them, you can bounce ideas off of them. Ludus is sort of playful, flirtatious, doesn't necessarily have to lead to anything else. So the Greeks had a term for that. I'm going to skip the next one and come back to it. Pragma is it's time-tested and loyal. There's also a certain practical element to it, where, like, when you see these couples who've been married for 60 years, there'll be times when they aren't the best of friends, where they don't really want to see each other, and yet they still have that connection. That's what pragma is. I don't want to make it sound like it's sort of that stay together for the sake of other people kind of thing. I know that's pretty common, but it's something close to that. And the last one, philautia, is self-love, a sort of healthy self-regard. There is a potential, however, for all the 5 that I just mentioned to be corrupted. Erotic love, of course, we know how that can be corrupted. Philia can become, possessive or manipulative, where we could kind of convince somebody that we're their friend when we don't really care about them at all, for some practical gain. Ludus, this playful, flirtatious love, I think we can all piece together how that goes wrong. Pragma can become kind of like, oh, damn it, I guess we just have to deal with each other kind of situation. Philautia, of course, we know that self-love can become very arrogant and problematic. That's where we get back to agape, that 4th one on the picture there. This is selfless, it is other-regarding, it sort of bears with people, it's forgiving, etc. It's the sort of perfect, selfless, eternal kind of love that we all aim to imitate, and that all those other forms of love can help us sort of build toward. That is the kind that John means when he talks about God. So he says God is this agape love. In short, there's so many uses for this term, love, in English, that we're going to kind of want to restrict it to that specific meaning, this elevated, perfected meaning, rather than worrying about those other possibilities, those other kinds that can be corrupted. Really quick note here, in English the word love is kind of restricted. It would be normal to say that we love somebody in a romantic relationship, that we love our family, that we love close friends. It would be a little bit abnormal to say that you love the postman, you know, um, or something like that. In Greek, that term is more broadly applied. So any kind of connection that involves positive goodwill, that involves sort of wanting the best for the other person, which we do even in the case of minor acquaintances like the postman. Uh, that counts in Greek, if that makes sense. I filled the next page with memes about the song What is Love because I knew that it would be stuck in your head anyway. The next step is talking about Jesus. How can we know what love is? In short, and here too you'll find some differences between the phases in the notes, but you'll get it. In short, we get to know something by experiencing it. We can't have love described to us in such a way that we would be able to understand it. A definition of love is kind of useless, or you can look it up in the dictionary, and a lot of you did when I said you can't define the term very effectively. But that dictionary definition would not allow someone who had never experienced love to know what love was. In Greek, there's a term, logos, which means word, but it means something more broad than word. It means the sort of outward signs by which you can get to know something or someone. So if you think about knowing a person, it would be their actions, it would be their words, it would be maybe body language would be some way you can get to know somebody, maybe just hearing their history from something like that. All that sort of sum total of things that allows you to know something. What allows us to know love? Well, the experience of love allows us to know love, which sounds kind of circular, and in a certain respect, it is. Jesus is the Word of God, but also is God. And this is what John says in the first verse of his first chapter. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that makes no sense to a lot of people. And so we just kind of skip over that section because it doesn't work. It actually used to get read at every single Catholic Mass in addition to the other gospel, but we don't do that so much anymore. What does it mean? It means that, uniquely in the case of love, the way we come to know love is itself an act of love. So God the Father and God the Son, Jesus, are the same thing in that they are both love. But Jesus is the love being shown into the world. In other words, it is this thing, love, that exists beyond time and space, independently of time and space, entering into time and space, because we experience everything in those four dimensions. So in order for us to know this thing that exists beyond our reality, it must become a part of our reality. And that is called, that is Jesus's, the whole idea behind Jesus. The sort of fancy term for this that you'll see again and again in future classes is the incarnation. In other words, the Word became flesh means the means by which that we could come to know God became a person in the person of Jesus Christ. And so this is kind of weird, but when we say that Jesus is God, what we mean is he's the person through whom we come to know God, but because of this unique thing where God and love are one and the same, he also is God. Kind of interesting. There's no good metaphors to explain this better, frankly, because every time you go into a metaphor, you accidentally say something that doesn't quite hit the mark. The closest thing I've ever heard is, perhaps we speak about like Mozart, and there's the actual guy who's been dead for 250 years or something like that. No, he died in 1791, so you do the math. There's Mozart himself, there's his music, if you go listen to it, and then there's like the sheet music. And so we use the term Mozart to refer to all three of those things, and they're all ways by which we would come to experience this person, and yet they're three different things. It's kind of confusing. try not to think too much about it. It is God is love itself. Jesus is love showing into the world. John goes a little further. He says, love only exists if it's shown. So, it would violate God's very nature to exist alone. Something else has to exist, otherwise to speak of the existence of love makes no sense. Therefore, because God exists, creation exists. Because it would be a contradiction in terms, it would not make logical sense to speak of love existing as the only thing. So, without love, there would simply be nothing, because there would be no point in there being anything. But John actually says the only reason there is something, the only reason reality exists at all, is because love did first. And so, we exist pretty much for this purpose. We live on a reality of love, based on love, but the world forgot that that's true. So the world behaves differently. The incarnation, Jesus, right, is love itself entering into our experience so that we can get a better sense of what love actually means. And that means that anything that is not love, anything that is contradictory to love, is a lie. God is love. Jesus is love showing itself into the world. The world does not know love, but anything that is not love is a lie. Hopefully you're with me so far. We looked at John's prologue. Chapter 1 is basically the Christian faith summed up in a few paragraphs, but it's super confusing and requires us to unpack it significantly. So there we go. We started the next class with a quick review of John's points. There they are. This is everything I already said. This is a picture of Jesus holding a lotus flower, which is an important symbol in Buddhism, but there you go. Anyway, so a little more about John's God. John speaks about the same set of beliefs that all three of the gospel writers do. All three other gospel writers do. But he does it a bit differently. So like all the gospel writers, John believes that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and unending. John simply explains a little bit better what exactly that means. Love is all-powerful because there is nothing that it cannot accomplish. Now immediately people say to me, what about a square circle? That's not a thing. So I guess to be eligible, to be something that love can do, it has to be an actual something. The other thing people say to me is, well, what about curing diseases? Love does cure diseases in many respects. I can't take away somebody's cancer, but I can lessen their suffering, certainly, by accompanying them. I can lessen their family's suffering. And the reason we bother treating people or researching diseases at all is because we care about them. If we didn't love, we wouldn't research any diseases that we didn't have. Like I said in class, in my family, that pretty much means diabetes at 45 or 50, and then high blood pressure later on. So if I did not love, those would be the only two ailments that I would ever research. Potentially skin cancer too, but we'll leave that alone. Irish people don't do so great in the sun, as it turns out. Regardless, love can accomplish anything, even things that it seems like it can't. All-knowing, the truth never needs to be hidden from true love. If there's something you could find out about someone, that would make you stop loving them, it's not that you don't love them, it's that your love could achieve greater depth. I think a good image would be, hopefully, and I know this is not the case in every situation, but the image that our culture has about parental love kind of works this way, where we like to believe that a parent would always care about their kid, and I know that's not true in every case, but that's kind of a good way to think of it. There's nothing that God could find out, so to speak, that would put us outside of love. This is the same idea we saw in the other Gospels, and this is the same idea we saw in the Old Testament too. Somehow or other, the unending thing makes it such that even if the universe is destroyed, there would still be love, because love exists independently of time. So it's not about the fact that it exists now and it won't exist later and it didn't exist before. It's about the fact that it exists at all and therefore exists in all possible times and places. Or about John's Jesus. Like all the gospel writers, he believes Jesus is the way to God. He explains a bit better. The story of Jesus in John is the story of love being shown to the world. If love is not shown to the world cannot come to know love. And we know from our own experience that the world very frequently does not know love because it hasn't been sufficiently shown to all parts of the world. Jesus gave a perfect example, we do believe that, but we need to imitate it so that that message that he started will get to every place. Every time Jesus says anything, he is showing the world that he's all about love. And we can experience Jesus whenever we experience love. Some people ask me in class, does this mean that people who aren't Christians experience Jesus all the time? The official position of the Catholic Church, and I can get you the citation for this, is yes. There has actually always been a significant level of comfort with the idea that people can be saved, so to speak, can have a connection with God outside of the church. That got written down finally in 1965. There's a doctrine called anonymous Christianity, where basically we believe that people do have connections with God through Christ, even if they're totally unaware that that's going on. So anyway, remember that. Jesus' love being shown. Finally, John's view of people. Like all the gospel writers, he believes people are good. Explains a little more. People exist to love and be loved. Since we are the only creatures on earth capable of fully understanding love to a significant degree, that makes us the most important. Sometimes people object, like, oh, my dog loves. I think we can all concede that the emotional depth that humans are capable of is far greater than that of a dog. I like dogs, but please do understand that humans need to be held in higher esteem according to Christianity. Otherwise, the whole system falls apart. Finally, this means that everything that ever happened before people led to the existence of people, because we need to exist. So when you talk about evolution or the Big Bang, those were conditions necessary to get to a universe where we exist within the universe. Sometimes people ask me, well, what if there's intelligent life on other planets? Yeah, that would be eligible too. Next chunk. We started looking at the actual texts. That first 23 minutes of the video, sorry, I make these too long, I know, was John's thesis. Here's how he uses his texts to support his thesis. There are 5 books credited to John. We're not going to look at Revelation until after the test. We looked very briefly at the letters because the letters just sort of explain the gospel, and then the gospel we looked at in some depth. Tradition says they were all written by John the Evangelist. Evangelist means gospel writer, also known as John the Beloved. There is a character in John's gospel called the disciple whom Jesus loved. He does not actually have a name in the gospel, but tradition has identified him as the Apostle John and identified him also as the guy who wrote the books. We do know that there were definitely multiple authors for these 5 books. The writing styles don't match, but the ideas are very, very similar, so it's reasonable to think that they may have come all from the same source, and people weren't too careful about assigning authors to texts back then. You guys already know that. So this is what we call the Johannine books, or you'll sometimes see it called the Johannine Corpus, Corpus, in fancier books. Don't worry about it. So, 5 texts. Here's the gospel. There are 4 parts. The prologue. That's John's big old thesis statement. I already mentioned that earlier in the video. The book of signs. Jesus doing a bunch of miracles to show love having power in the world. The book of glories. Jesus telling the disciples that they will both suffer, that he and they, will both suffer, and that it will be okay in the long run. This includes a big discourse where Jesus explains what's going on to the disciples, and it includes the passion stories. Story, I guess. Finally, there's an epilogue in chapter 21. After the resurrection, Jesus meets with the disciples and, sort of confirms that even death itself had no power over love. So they should have all the courage they could ever imagine because they can't lose the one thing that matters the most, which is love. We looked at the 7 signs. There's the list. It's on your notes already, so I'm just going to go past it pretty quickly. The point of the 7 signs is to show love having power over negative aspects of life. So love does have power over disease and death and disability and all this other stuff. And it makes sense that if love is the reason everything exists, then it should have some power over everything. So each sign kind of shows, is John using a story as evidence that love, in fact, is the foundation of the world, even though it's really easy for us to forget that. We read the story of Lazarus together, that's one of the 7 signs, and then we sort of split into groups and looked at the other 7 signs. The next class, we looked at the I am statements. John says, another way that John is going to show Jesus' connection to God is by having him say, I am, 45 times. I am is a really, a throwaway phrase, obviously, but the way that it's written in Greek makes it pop off the page. Greek is such that the grammar is set up so that you can potentially skip the word I or skip the word am, and the sentence will pretty much still make sense. When both of them are included, it's very deliberate. And in this case, it's because we want to draw a connection back to Exodus. In Exodus 20, maybe? I don't know what chapter, it doesn't matter. It's not 20. Regardless, God says that his name is I am who am, which could also be translated potentially as I am that which is. We know that according to John, that which truly is love. So whenever Jesus says this phrase, I am, he's making it clear that his purpose is to reveal God, to reveal love to the world. He's making it clear that his power comes directly from God, from love, and he's making he's actually in speaking showing the world what God is all about. We read a couple examples. I am the good shepherd here. I am the way, the truth, and the life here. And then I had to split up and sort of look at some of the other ones. Next chunk, the Book of Glories. Jesus is going to explicitly explain here what it means to live out of love. He says it's going to involve suffering, sacrifice, and death because the world does not know love. You will find this in your life, that if you are the one truth teller in a big group of liars, the people all know you're telling the truth, but they hate you for it. When you live in a world that doesn't know the truth, that it is based on love, in reality, it kind of does subconsciously know the truth, and if you speak out loudly enough in favor of love, a lot of people are going to hate your guts. Just know that if you do the right thing in life, you're going to get enemies. So there's that. But we need to make the sacrifice because it is the right thing to do. It's the truth. We can't go it alone. We need God. We need one another. There's no such thing as a self-made man. There's no such thing as, no man is an island. You know this already. We need each other. We belong to one another, and when we forget that, bad stuff happens. So Jesus reminds them in no uncertain terms that they should stick together and that the community matters tremendously. Sorry. There's always hope because love is eternal. There is nothing we can do to change God. There's no amount of time or space that could elapse that would cause the slightest change because this is eternally true. Jesus reminds them of that very clearly over and over again. We are also able to do everything Jesus did and more as long as we act lovingly. Jesus actually says this, so I'm not just going crazy here. He says, you will be able to do all these things and even greater things besides because you act out of love. So there's that. And the reason we'll be able to do greater things is because we exist in other times and places, and we're different people and everything like that. So if we're acting lovingly, our own unique collection of gifts and strengths and talents and wonderfulness it can be put at the service of this larger project of bringing love into the world, and therefore we will do really amazing stuff. This splits into the discourse, which is Jesus talking for a while, and the Passion, which is Jesus' arrest, trial, suffering, and ultimately resurrection. The discourse is Jesus explaining everything, basically explaining his beliefs. Starts with feet washing, which is, he does this for the disciples. It's an act of love. It's something you would only probably ever do in the ancient world for your own children, so it's really symbolic. And it basically goes to show that they need to keep hope alive no matter how bad stuff gets, because he's shown this act of love. And basically, the argument is that this act of love is actually more important even than death itself. So, what do we learn about Christian love in this discourse? Well, one thing, we learn that it is freely given and cannot be earned. Um, that's important. What does it mean for love to be freely given? It basically means that God's love is unearned, it is not to be taken away, and therefore it's the permanent truth. The permanent truth is that you are good, that you are loved, and you are deserving of love, and you are capable of loving others in return. And that is a beautiful, beautiful truth. And so we need to live by it. That's the idea. And because it's true, we can learn to love ourselves, we can learn to love other people, and that those two loves will kind of be self-reinforcing. As we learn to be more at peace with ourselves, we'll be more at peace with others, and as we learn to be more at peace with others, we'll learn to be more at peace ultimately with ourselves too. Christian love is also fearless, because we know that we can't lose the one thing that matters most. We cannot lose love. So technically, even death itself is meaningless. Now, we don't experience it that way, so I don't want to make it sound like, a good Christian just kind of laughs in the face of death. Death sucks, obviously. So does illness. And we have these sort of beautiful emotional realities that we live in, right? And we need to acknowledge how we feel about things in order to be healthy people, right? And we'd be crazy if we weren't sad when people died, or even when the dog died, or anything like that, right? But ultimately, we have this promise that even in the bleakest, darkest, most terrible moments, love still wins. We should have hope. Finally, fearlessness and forgiveness both show love. If you're fearless, you know that you can't lose the one thing that matters most. If you're forgiving, you realize that the most important thing is keeping a community together, keeping your connections with other people alive. Because no petty vengeance could ever have the kind of power that love has. So when you see Jesus being fearless or forgiving, that is also proof of his connection back to this God who is love. That is him showing this love into the world and trying to get us to move past a point where we doubt the truth of love and still try to act in accord with the ways of the world. The last thing we did in class, I don't have slides here about the Passion story. What we did is we split it up. What you can see as you read through it is that the entire thing connects back also to this project. This project of God is love, Jesus is love showing itself into the world. If you read through some of the scenes, if you were out that day, you'll see what I mean. It's really very beautiful. Every single scene from John, every single scene in John, but especially after the Passion stories kind of start in chapter 12, ultimately does connect back to this larger theme of love is permanent, love is eternal, live that way. Hopefully this video is somewhat helpful. Again, sorry it was late. I'll have it posted by 9 o'clock. I'm only an hour late. Good luck tomorrow, guys. Thanks.